Welcome again to the new Kevin Smith, The Great Witness Show. The new adventure series is. I'm Dean Bell, here with Dean Kevin Smith, who will be sharing his real side experiences with us today. And we can learn a lot from these experiences about recognizing what's real. And here's Kevin now. Hi, Kevin.
In this real side experience, I would find myself in a kind of a compound or other, it reminding me somewhat of similar places that I and other aware individuals utilize as bases, as it were, in various locations throughout the real side. A little like the real side experience I shared, where the black pumas, aware individuals taking their form, were attempting to hide in the snow from the dark force hunter, and there was a bunker established at that location also, where I would meet up with other new friends stationed there. I have the notion that these new friend and guide bunker type bases are rather temporary, as though they are placed only as long as is necessary, as though a decided and agreed to idea that effects as a simulated position instantly on the real side, and with the agreements between the aware individuals, having them all able to be featuring in each other's experience also in these created buildings. And also they are a little like the universal universities, whereby only those of a certain degree of awareness, recognition, but most importantly, real intent and sincerity with life, and making sense with everything life is, can enter them. For those of a personal self-serving nature, those with agendas and intents that are not beneficial, awareness and life speaking, cannot access the universities, the genuine ones that is, nor these temporary bunkers that pop into manifestation on the real side. Such buildings would, of course, still be part of the simulation, as anything visual that the personal self can relate to must be so, but simulated buildings that will simply not be accessible, or indeed recognizable, to anyone not connecting with their real awareness and stepping up with the guides and Dwayne, because in reality the simulation of the real side is always what we decide that it is, and the extent to which we can explore it depends on the degree by which we allow the real awareness and the guides, this overall real isness reality, to show us more of the simulation than we currently are aware of. If we remain with our personal consciousness, we have decided the extent of our simulation on the physical and the real side, which is really the same simulation, of course, a simulation that can only be what we have limited ourselves to through a consciousness we cling to. and choose to not see anything beyond. And so, these universities and these temporary bunkers are places that require a moving beyond the standard consciousness, or they won't be available. It's as though they exist, but in a place where only those who risk take to step beyond their personal selves will see. And so really, no guide or anyone is preventing anyone from entering the real universities or these bunker bases other than the individual themselves, who chooses to remain with the personal consciousness that simulation doesn't include these other positions, places, and structures on the real side. Could an individual then, with ill intent, if aware of these real universities, step outside their consciousness of simulation limitation to access these places? Anything's possible, but life and the guides and the real awareness do see the individual's intent, and it is a genuine, sincere intent to see more with life that can facilitate life and the guides taking the individual through the process of awareness, that they can see and be more than their consciousness, as everything equals itself. If an individual has a personal self, unbeneficial with life agendas, then this equals a remaining with the personal self, as anything other than sincere beingness of intent, and with the aligning attitudes of sincerity and gratitude through the personal self, will have the individual just experiencing their bubbles of personal self-serving ideas, and in fact they have then disallowed the guides from assisting them, as life cannot support anyone, cannot afford the awareness to allow more to be seen for anyone that chooses to be in a disconnected personal self position from it. And although these simulated positions cannot be the ultimate, the universities and such, they are still a step toward the recognition of the is beyond all simulation. But that cannot be so for anyone who is agreeing still with their consciousness, or compounding the consciousness further with idea agendas and ill-intended schemes. And so, just as you can't trick or fool life, it knows your intent, so could an individual be unlikely to access the real universities and these bunkers and bases that are designed for temporary meeting areas for new friends and guides on the real side, that can only be available for those sincerely stepping beyond their consciousness personal selves, as it's as though these places exist in their own reality within the simulation, yes, but beyond the simulation of the overall consciousness. Anyway, in this removed from the general simulation of the consciousness, I would be, and with a number of other aware beings also. Such places do then require standing in the nowness of the real awareness, and any fluctuation between the real awareness and the personal self-consciousness can result in a diminishing of what can be seen and experienced. For if the personal self-consciousness simulation does not include such places, then to step into the personal self would have one removed from such buildings. They are still there, as everything is here and now, but we are now immersed in a simulated bubble that the consciousness lacks the idea agreements of such places to allow the effect to be included, like a computer game that has a far greater world to explore, but that we have temporarily disabled the files that allow for us to see it all. And if we fluctuate back and forth, if we do not concretize the nowness, real awareness position in such places, we get a combination of a personal self-consciousness simulated effects rather intermeshing and interwoven with the experience, and rather have to tease these out, to recognize then the experience beyond the personal self-consciousness infringement. And in this case, due to my real awareness nowness state not stabilized, so it was as though parts of the experience were harder to grasp, as though almost out of reach. There were many groups of aware individuals coming and going, all on assignment, all returning here as though taking a moment for discussion, evaluation, and planning for what was next. And as I was engaging with all the groups, my real awareness was at any rate, but my fluctuating focus at this moment was making it far harder for my personal self to hear all the dialogue that was had, as though a radio station not fully tuned into. But I had at least the overall sense of what was going on, just not the details, and maybe the details were not so important. It's also as though this bunker housed a number of portals of a kind that these various groups were utilizing, and although portaling, motion, point to point, is the simulated creational side, and through awareness such is unnecessary, as everything is in the nowness of our real awareness, and so travelling by any fashion is unnecessary, until we reach a point where we are standing completely real with our real awareness, we are resigned somewhat with a personal self that does still need to have the effects of agreed to emotion to relate to. And also, as we are engaging with beings and individuals throughout creation on the physical and the real side, where the construction of the simulation and motion through it is also based on decided agreement, and unless we want to sit in our real awareness aside from the simulation, and therefore we won't be engaging very much with all the multitudes that are only operating in the simulated side, those we need to try and reach. We do need then to rather work with what is available, what has been decided on, the portals, etc. But suddenly, from outside of our bunker, which would be more than in the consciousness simulated personal side, beyond the simulation of our position, came the sound of a baby wailing. This must have been discernible only to the real awareness, as the personal self would only be receiving visual and audio input from its immediate position, and although from a literal simulated perspective the sound came from outside, it was in fact from a different dimension of the simulation in fact. And even though we are multi-dimensional, the personal self just deals in generally single positions at a time, like vehicles, and with the corresponding sound and imagery. The real awareness not so resigned, and a real awareness, that is this overall awareness, that is through all the simulation of a consciousness, and so can experience everything of the simulation in the nowness of its reality, and then will transmit that which it wants the personal self to hear, see, or be aware of. I would venture then outside, removing myself from this simulated position that was a recognitional and awareness position aside from the simulation beyond it, for that which was beyond was the overall consciousness simulation, and that which it contained, the ideas, one would need to agree with, to engage with, that we then experience the effects and step into. The idea then to agree with, to feature in the effects of, was what was transpiring that my real awareness was drawn to, the baby crying, and it became apparent that the source of the baby crying was, yes, a baby, and clutched in the arms of presumably its mother. She seemed somewhat in distress, and I would read her intent through the real awareness. As often we can be tricked and misled through what seems to be sincere situations on the surface, but by engaging with them, and if they turn out to be a dark force ruse creation or a trick, we then are taking on other effects. We can be drawn into dark force entanglements if the overall idea is based on ill intentionality, as we rather have decided to experience what would be then an attack or abrasive situation, like agreeing to upload a program onto our computer without checking to see if it contains viruses first, then having the corresponding computer issues. But she seemed sincere, though somewhat oblivious of where she was, only that she seemed in peril. But my impressions were that although she wasn't especially aware, the child she carried was. And now the reason for her distress became apparent, as these large beings loomed out of the surrounding environment, which was in fact shrouded in a dense fog. They were giants, though not overly huge, but a good 15 feet or so in height. They also looked as though they were Arabs, the coloration of the skin dark, their clothing of a type you see with such individuals, and they all bore rifles. They would raise their guns and direct them at me and the woman. I would raise my hands, but step protectively in front of the mother and her child, and she and the child would fade away after a few moments. It was as though these tall, Arabic-looking characters were not intending to kill the baby, but as though they were unnerved by it in some way, and their automatic reaction was to brandish weapons in a threatening manner, as though this was their general, routine, reactionary consciousness, but with no real intent to harm the child or its mother, as although agitated as they were by a baby that seemed to exude a purity and sincerity of awareness, they knew on a level of themselves, probably their own real awareness or personal self-intuition, not to harm a baby that, by my impression, was perhaps one of these beings coming through to the physical that are very special at this time, and may be very instrumental with developments that are awareness and life beneficial. Perhaps based on the appearance of these giants, suggested a baby soon to be featuring in that part of the world that would cause great agitation by the sheer isness standing that the baby had. But I can imagine that were a real guide, as an example, were to assume a physical level form and present themselves, they would have such a presence, such a purity, that most simply would not be moved to even consider harming such, despite how such a presence must be agitating for those who wish to maintain their comfort zone, personal self-convinced positions, and not consider anything beyond them. And so, as I said, the seeming aggressiveness had no real intent behind it, just a reaction really, through a routine consciousness, without a substance, and these giants seemed unconcerned when the mother and baby faded away, perhaps relieved in a way that which was causing them agitation was now removed from their experience. I would speak for a time with these giant characters. I fail to recall exactly what we spoke of, but as they were not especially aware beings, I gauged this and spoke more in literal terms about creation and so forth, seeing how much they would accept before the walls went up and they would hear no more, and then the scene would switch, and I would find myself in a temple of stone, an ancient-looking structure, perhaps representing a very ancient and rigid consciousness, as buildings tend to represent the personal self-consciousness of individuals, and would very much then be a reflection of the sort of consciousness the being was. That is, if individuals are indeed found within them on the real side, or groups of individuals, which then represents a shared collective consciousness. Absent of individuals, then the buildings would represent just ideas, and based on what transpires would we ascertain as to what these ideas might be. But then the consciousness is just a collection of ideas anyway, so we can say that generally all buildings are idea representing. It's just whether the representation is for our recognition of a single idea, or that of the building being a consciousness of an individual or a collective. In this case, there was some being or other that this temple was the consciousness representation of. And yes, the being was very ancient, very rigid in its decided restriction, but a consciousness also that had developed along very creationally powerful lines, the ability to manipulate creation, and for this being, its choice was to use its skills abrasively, to impose on others the power aspect, but as with everything, only where agreement could allow. With a simulation so old, so compounded with cause and effect agreements, with all beings all interwoven into each other's karma, as all karma agreements will be with an old simulator, especially with a consciousness that is controlled over all, a control that can only be so if everyone's consciousness is moulded into the same agreements that allow everyone to experience the same controlled simulation, an overall agreement to simulation that must then have everyone's karma entangled and interwoven through this constant controlling agreement idea theme. So really, to agree with the consciousness, to stay with the personal self only, is probably an open door to most, if not all, beings to feature in our experience at any time, as all beings share this same overall agreement to control that forges this overall simulation of control reality, like all the individual codes that make up a computer game. All are involved, are part of the program, and are intermingled, and effect the game that must be the expression of the combined individual coding. The simulation shared is the sum of its parts, the consciousness that makes it up, and so the individuals must be locked in each other's experience. As their agreements hold up the simulation they collectively agree to, like bricks that make up a building. And so this ancient and powerful being here had plenty of agreements to play with, to involve itself in the experiences of others, and to exact its abrasiveness when it decided to. But at this time, a lot of disrupting individuals are being put in the phantom zone, displaced and put out of the way, experiencing what they had really decided for themselves, effects equaling their own abrasiveness that can be measured out in the simulators in such ways. And it was a similar situation here, as though this being had who knows how many eons of fun at the expense of others, such was its sensation. And as it continued to cause disruption now, and presenting resistance and obstacles for what Dwayne and the guides are doing, with its karma always there to be called in at any time, it was decided for its karma to be due, and so the guides were in a position to creatively manage the effects this being had decided for itself, and rather contained it that it could cause no further mischief. For as our group entered its personal self-experience, entering into the temple of its consciousness, for as much as such beings can march into the experiences of others through agreements in the consciousness, the door swings both ways, and we would see how it was seemingly contained, frozen in place, as though in a kind of stasis field. I didn't have much by way of impression as to the nature of this being, the appearance it took on, its body form, just that of its overall intent, life choices of abrasiveness, the power it was able to harness, and how it was contained now, as though being frozen, and unable to exact any more destruction. However, it seemed to have a large quantity of minions and agreeable beings that did its bidding, contained as it was, and these would seem to be along the lines of entities, and taking the form of large spiders, as entities have a tendency to seemingly do. They would swarm us, and we would defend ourselves accordingly. Agreeing with this overall idea, with this contained being's consciousness, the decision to feature in the simulation of it would also open ourselves up to attack, as was the overall design, inclination, and nature of its consciousness, and featuring also would be those that served it, as agreement with this ancient being had us taking on not just the effects of it, but of those whose agreements were intermingled with its consciousness. So always we take on more than just what we see on the surface, as we agree with an individual that they can feature in our experience along with their intent and inclinations. And although the spider entities were dealt with, although this being was contained, and could do nothing further seemingly, as though its ability to create had been frozen, like a kind of a phantom zone, it had already set certain things in motion on the real side. It had taken advantage of agreements to trap a number of beings, those that were becoming more aware but very vulnerable, being at stages of awareness where they were unable to step enough into the real awareness where situations of adversity could be handled effectively through the real awareness. For the personal self-consciousness is festooned with agreements to control and subjugation of doubt, fear, etc., and to stand in that is very much a counter and a block to the real awareness and its ability to handle all and every situation. In regards to an individual that is attacking us, say, agreements were there that allowed the attack to feature in our simulated experience, and very often the agreements, generally subconscious, can be that such individuals have power over us, and consequently this will express as a simulated attack, with us receiving a battering, as this is what we have decided to in fact experience. But the real awareness is aside from all these simulating, effecting attack potentialities, always does what makes sense with life, with the real awareness that it is, and so will handle all situations that serve this making sense with awareness idea. It will do whatever is required that benefits all life, if allowed to do so. If we don't sit in the personal self, where agreements to control can lessen or even nullify the real awareness's effectiveness, because this would be our free will to be then attacked through the consciousness that effects what we have decided as to its construction. And so, although sincere enough, the holding to the consciousness, the not letting it go, and standing completely in the nowness of the real awareness during real side situations of abrasiveness, where to do so would have the individual automatically protected if it made sense with awareness to do so. So are individuals just starting out on their awareness process rather vulnerable, and these individuals had been trapped in what seemed to be containers, and were in the process of being drowned in the turbulent waters of a sea or other, and the group and I would remove ourselves from this scene, the temple consciousness with its contained occupant, and we rather exacted a rescue operation. We would prise open the containers as they bobbed in the stormy waters, and set the trapped beings free. Again a case of, despite being more vulnerable, with the sincere, real, intended individual, they are always open and in agreement to assistance, despite their lack of awareness hamstringing their own real awareness ability to help themselves. But then we are all this overall same real awareness through all the individual personal selves, and where one individual may be less capable due to the clinging to the limiting and real awareness ability blocking personal self, the real awareness can operate with greater effective ease through another personal self and its simulation, a simulation shared through agreement with the personal self of the other who is in peril, and so can the real awareness assist one of its personal selves through the interjection of another personal self. All real awareness being a reality aside from the simulation and never in any danger, but having to operate through a personal self that will allow it to work in order to feature in the simulation shared through agreement with another personal self, one that is hampering its real awareness effectiveness. And a brief final scene where I would be with a group. The only one I recognized was Windy Sky, and we were in fact watching the skies, for we knew that soon they would be filled with alien craft. A sense of expectation for their arrival, and a further hint of this impending situation, of the mass arrival and the aliens making their presence known on the Earth, with the additional impression that despite the real side experiences had by people recently of hostile alien invasion, and that this is just as likely a possibility then, there still seems to be the beneficial and making sense with life, stepping up aliens, still intending to also feature in the experience of humanity on a global and very apparent scale.
You know, I don't have a lot to comment, but I just did the. It just reminded me of the bunkers. Remind me of the Apache Scouts. This is kind of off the subject, but in a way it's related. But the Apache Scouts here in like Arizona, and especially the Lupin. Well, there's different groups of Apaches, but they had these bunkers. The Scouts, particularly, had these foxholes that they dug out every 100 miles or something like that to rest and sleep in, and they'd store food in there when they traveled. And this would give them a means of again, traveling through enemy territory and just traveling in general and providing for themselves, but they planned for it. So these bunkers that you talk about, yeah, they're like places temporary, but in creation, necessary sometimes to plan ahead for what's coming. And these Apaches would do this to aid in their travels. And living with nature, these Indians were basically, as I see it, astrophysical. So they were immersed in nature. They could, according to some stories, astral project and see things like they'd set traps, hunting traps, and they'd see it when the trap was triggered and the animal was caught. They could see this from remote viewing, basically. They were able to like be with nature and be immersed in the activities in their surrounding environment really well, because they didn't have technology and all that. So they were, it just shows you what can be done, what can be had when you're living, supporting the natural environment. And you mentioned, existing in their own reality, these bunkers. Well, that's the same with the Indians and their environment. They exist in their own basically reality. I mean, they're surviving off of it, but not harming it. They're supporting it. So they have a relationship with it. They can kind of create with it to survive without harming it. So these bunkers that you talked about too just reminded me of that. These stories about the Apache Scouts, which I'll probably get into more in one of our shows. They're kind of interesting characters. They were the protectors of the tribe, basically. They had the skills of a warrior, hunter, tracker, and they could basically see further than the rest of the people in the tribe. Their vision and their awareness was more so because they hone their awareness, their skills to. Now it's most likely astrophysical only, but still it's more so than the regular traditional physical, one literal, one-sided, one-dimensional view. So that's just my my contribution here. The bunkers just set me off with that. So these bunkers, can you talk about more about those? Just curious.
Yeah, these bunkers were temporary positions that the new friends and I were occupying in, and we have been doing in various real side experiences, because it just depends on the situation. Sometimes we will stand in our real awareness completely aside from the simulation, that we then are not involved with it directly or featuring in the simulated effects. So we are not taking anything of it on, and so that's a good way to avoid any confrontation or entanglements of any kind. And so from there, we are simply observing. And then there are some situations where we want to engage more directly for various reasons. The main one being that the vast majority of creation, including the controllers, are those we want to get the attention of and present with the opportunity of the ears. And so, because they are disconnected from their real awareness, as all individuals will be until they make that connection, they are immersed completely in their personal selves, and therefore the simulation that affects from however their consciousness is constructed. And so we could engage with their real awareness, being to being, and indeed that's what the guides do initially. They will connect with the real awareness of the individual, and they'll only do that when the real awareness of the individual is ready and deciding to recognize the isness that it is. And then the trick is to get the attention of the personal self, because the disconnect is between the personal self and the real awareness, which are effectively then two different beings. And so the idea is, when we go on to creation, we do have to feature in the simulated side to get the attention of the personal selves of the individuals initially, and we can only do that if we engage with whatever their simulation is, work within the parameters of it, find all the agreements that allow our entry into it, however they may be, even if they're backdoor agreements, which is a very common thing also, because as people's agreements are intermeshed with others, so they share simulation. And so if we want to feature in the experience of one individual, but we can't find an agreement doorway in, we can access their simulation through the simulation they share with others. That's what I call backdoor agreements, and that works the same way with the controllers. They can sneak into our simulation if we happen to agree or be engaging with certain individuals or ideas that have agreement ties with them. And so when it comes to these bunkers, so we have the two extremes. We have the one position of being the real awareness overview of everything, where we are aside from the simulation, and then we have the other opposite option of engaging with the simulation, that we can be featuring the effects of it, and then with that comes all the confrontation, etc. But there's another option as well, where we can be in the simulation, but we can be within certain simulated effects that we have created. that are not incorporated into the consciousness of other beings, that they therefore cannot enter that particular part of the simulation. And so it's almost as though we have little pocket simulated areas that are created almost as a bases that we can sit in, that isn't the real awareness overview position, but is not as it is simulated, but is not a simulation that is shared by the overall created consciousness, that they then can march into our bunkers and start confronting us. So, and these little bunkers then we sort of create, and we sit in almost as little bases. So we go out onto the field, as it were, carry out our assignments, and then we may retreat to these bunkers and sort of discuss what happened and what took place, almost as a little sort of a in-between places. And so, like the other day where I shared the idea of the intergalactic camper van, where we were inside of that and gallivanting across creation. Again, it was the same idea. We were just using another vehicle, which was another idea, which was simulation, which we had all agreements with the group that we're in that we could feature in each other's experience. But the camper van was almost an idea agreement that was aside from the ideas of the vast majority of the consciousness of this creation, so that none could impose upon our camper van. And there were a few occasions where the camper van was attacked, but none could breach its defences, and that basically represented their inability to encroach upon a simulation that doesn't feature in their consciousness as an idea, therefore they can't experience the effects of. So that's really what these bunkers are. Yes.
In other words, this is creation, and we can create anything we want. So if we create something that is not relatable to, at least for now, to others, then there's somewhat of a protection or some kind of a relief, or place where safety, you could say, that we could recover in, like you say, and talk about it and go back and kind of recovery area. But this is creation, so like that's what the controllers are trying to suppress people's imagination and creativity, is keep them one-sided, one-dimensional, because they don't want people to be get carried away with their imagination, because it's a threat to them. So this is a great example. Thank you.
This real side experience would begin as more impressions. Anything that is visual, scenes and imagery, is the simulation, whereas the true reality, the isness, is an everything reality, that is a recognition through the real awareness, that is, this isness. If you're in a reality where everything is, there's going to be nothing isolated, differentiated, or segregated from anything else, for there would be no space, distance, point to point, of motion or time. But to recognize this isness, there must be a means of comparison, a simulated reality that isn't this everything reality, so the difference can be determined. A simulated reality where through the creation of ideas can effects and sequences of events and situations be experienced that provide differentiation, motion, and the process of idea causes to effects that present as though the passage of time. You construct your consciousness vehicle with its ideas, and you place your awareness within it, like putting on a virtual reality headset. Then the mechanics convert the ideas, to effect experiences that you perceive through the senses of the physical vehicle. Take off the headset, move out of the consciousness, be in the nowness aside from thoughts, emotion, and imagination, and you're standing in your real awareness, the true reality, aside from the simulation. From that position, you are in the only position where you can recognize the ease, for you must be in your real awareness and nowness, that is this isness, to do so. If you're activating anything of the personal self, you're no longer in this nowness, and are then in the effects you have created. You're in the simulation, and you can't recognize the ease through the personal self that is only designed to perceive the simulation it effects. Although recognition of the ease may not yet have been achieved, standing in the nowness of the real awareness, isness reality, is where you receive additional insights that are beyond what is simulated. The personal self only knows what it does according to the references it has filed, like a computer, and if we remain with the personal self at any point, we can only know what we do according to the references as they stand. To see and be more requires to step beyond what we know, the personal self, and into the unknown, that which is beyond the personal self. Or we just stay at the point where we are and rather revolve on the spot. There's always an endlessness of more to be aware of, and the process only stops when we become satisfied with the position we are in. But taken to its eventual conclusion would be a completing of awareness, in that we are aware of everything of creation and the consciousness that effects it. Then is the big step of now that we are fully aware to recognize the ease through the real awareness. But despite not recognizing the ease as yet, we still will receive impressions from the real awareness, as with the connection to it that we establish, can we better interpret what's transpiring on the real side, for the personal self alone can only draw upon its references and knowledge, and only apply that to what it visually can see, the simulation of the experiences. But for various reasons, we may not be provided experiences that are just visual, just simulated, and some, in fact, have very little, if anything, visual going on with them, that were it left to the personal self, it may dismiss them as irrelevant, or in the case of insights or experiences that are completely devoid of simulation, they will pass the personal self by as though nothing was there. And for a personal self alone that can only deal in simulation, anything other than simulation will not be registered by the personal self, and so for the personal self nothing was there. But in comes the real awareness impressions that make sense of what seems inconsequential, or just impressions on their own that we must recognize and then apply literal explanation through the personal self. And so visually I would have the vague simulation imagery of a kind of perimeter in the shape of a box, and it was a box becoming ever smaller. My impressions through the real awareness was of this representing a creation, and how it was again an indication of the simulator collapsing, based on the restriction of the agreement ideas through the consciousness that affects a simulator that is impacting in on itself. The scene would switch, and I would find myself in my physical level street recreated on the real side. There would be one other individual present, and he seemed to have arranged across the street what looked like lines and lines of computer code. I had the impression this code represented the simulator. The simulator is like one huge, multi-dimensional computer game. All the ideas and agreements that make it up are like the base frequencies or coding of the overall game that each individual decodes into the simulation they experience through the body vehicles. So very much the idea agreements of the simulation can be expressed as frequencies or code, and it was as though the entirety of the simulation was presented on my street through the coding that was laid out across it. This wouldn't make sense from a creational, spatial perspective, as the coding, the ideas of an entire simulation, would surely require more area than a single street. But nevertheless, this was my impression. The individual who had displayed this code now proceeded to start deleting parts of it, and my impression was that he intended to delete it all. I also impressioned that the individual was a guide, and it wasn't that he was destroying a creation, but more that suggesting the potentiality of agreement through the overall consciousness changing to such an extent that effectively the code was rewritten, and then of course change the agreement idea overall coding, and you change the simulation. As seems to be being hinted at is the possibility of a complete remodeling of the simulation, one that doesn't allow for the incursion of the dark forces, and that is then a far cleaner and effective training area for recognition of the is from, without the interference, subliminals, and disruption from those evidently content to remain in creation, but also to keep everyone else in it also as their slaves. Of course, such an event would require agreement, but perhaps at this time then, rather a separation, a second simulator being made available for those that do want to progress awareness speaking, and for those that don't, well, they then remain with what they have decided, a simulator where the consciousness is infused with agreements to control and restriction. Amusingly, I actually grabbed a portion of this coding while the guide was erasing it, as though whatever this particular coding represented was something my personal self wanted to keep, perhaps emotionally attached to ideas, and I rather clung and hugged this coding to myself. The guide was all a business, no nonsense, and although he wouldn't take the coding from me, if I wanted to keep it, it was my free will right to cling on to the ideas it represented. He was rather stern with me, through my nonsensical decision to do so. I would realise the foolishness of wanting to cling on to that which would then, as the experience was expressing, have me remain in the current simulator with all the consciousness of restriction and control. Just like if we hold on to any created idea, we can't supersede creation and stand in the isness, so was it a similar idea here, that if at this moment we hang on to anything of the current consciousness, we can't then transition into what seems to be a new and purer simulation, to continue on with our process of awareness, absent of the presence of controlling infection that is interwoven with the overall consciousness as it currently stands, agreement to control which allows then the constant bombardment and restriction and control into our simulated experience. And so I relinquished the code, returned it to the guide, and he continued with deleting it all. Perhaps then it was my consciousness code contribution to the simulator as it currently stands that was being deleted, and I had extended agreement for this to be so, and the guides and life were going about the necessaries to make it happen, with a little last-moment personal self-reluctance, a few emotional attachments to the current simulator consciousness, but ultimately I released these too. And as I have recounted previously, when things take place in my street on the real side, this indicates that this is an occurrence that will, if agreements are retained, occur very soon on the physical level. For all ideas are instantly so on the real side, but for these ideas to take physical level form, agreements must filter through to the personal selves, and action taken on the physical to activate them. So the transition would be from the ideas being revealed on the real side in random locations and scenes, to them growing in weight through continued sustained agreement that has them then feature in recreated physical level street scenes and settings, which indicate they are on the verge of coming through to the physical level, and so suggesting there is enough agreement that this new simulation detaching from the current diseased and infected one, may be on the verge of being so, for those that agree and let go of the current one, which must be a letting go of every idea, agreement, and attachment, just as you would need to if you were to position yourself in the real universes. For your current consciousness of agreements and attachments are a part of the current simulator, so to skip simulators, as it were, you do need to unshackle yourself from the one you are vacating. Also, there was a brief view of my being on the top floor of my house, my personal self-representation on the real side. I was then operating in the unseen parts of the self, where often we are shown what's taking place, what's impacting us from the other dimensional parts of the self that will eventually filter through to the physical, as everything does. From my position in the house, the window I was looking from overlooked the back garden, which was the subconscious. This is the bigger part of the consciousness, and that which needs to be fully explored, opened up, and revealed as to all that it comprises of, all the agreements, attachments that are not in our current conscious memory vehicles, that until faced and released will have us the continued effect of. So very often we can expect to encounter monsters and creatures that are the manifestations of these old unearthed agreements and attachments, as fear is very much interfused with the consciousness, and so these unveiled, fear-infused ideas then often take the forms as creatures that present as fearful, much like the subconscious monster in the movie Forbidden Planet, and the ultimate expression of a fear being the supreme deceptor, the being which has been created from a fear-laced overall consciousness. Also into the subconscious will go all the various subliminals we are bombarded with, and also all the ideas that enter our experience that we don't consciously consider or evaluate as to the benefit of, and then dismiss if not beneficial awareness-wise. And the subliminals, once nestled in, will be affecting experience as readily as any other idea, for as they become a part of the consciousness, so must they generate the effects. And if we sit with the personal self only, we agree then with however the consciousness is programmed, consciously or subconsciously. But here I saw, sprouting from the subconscious back garden, a huge tree, and it would bear fruit the size of basketballs. I would reach forward from the window, pluck a fruit, and bite into it, and it was indeed pleasing to my taste buds, tasting a little like a fig. My impression was that these were subliminals that had entered my subconscious, that I wasn't consciously aware of, but was being shown now. but representing beneficial subliminal ideas based on how the idea was being expressed as a tree and bearing healthy fruit, representing an idea that is aligned with all that is natural. I was reminded of Dwayne speaking of how he had Enki and Enlil taking control of some of the infrastructure of the dark forces, that which was used to instill distorted and controlling subliminals into the consciousness of humanity, but instead was being used then to put in subliminals that were real references to the true reality and the new you song, etc. I had the impression then that this was along those lines, that of healthy, all-natural environment supporting ideas, making sense with life ideas that were implanted into the subconscious of not just mine, but very likely humanity at large. And perhaps this is a verification of how this had been going on also, the utilizing of technology for beneficial subliminal purposes. And then a brief scene where I was in the form of an eagle, and flying beside me was another eagle, and we both soared high in the skies, a representation of being afforded a greater view over the consciousness of creation. A bird, like any animal, will represent real awareness, as all animals are directly real awareness connected, before the body form assumed has additional facilities, that of the literal mind, that has the individual then free will self-deciding and disconnecting from the real awareness, as the personal awareness is formed, and becomes separated and lost in its own created illusions. And my impression was the other eagle was a real guide that had taken this form also.
Well, you talked in the beginning about, well, people having trouble really relating to this reality, this isness we're talking about. Sometimes you need a shock to, like, wake-up call. Like people who are in car accidents, that boom, like it kind of shocks them into, like, or not into, but well, it could be into their real awareness or outside the simulator, to help them to see that how they are agreeing to this simulator or creational bubble. And once you get this kind of shock, it rattles your reality, and you have an opportunity to consider something else. And sometimes people need that. There's also the thing called PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. The soldiers who see war, and I mean that rattles you. See the carnage and all that. It's outside the comfort zone of usual living. You see more. You see the that part of creation that's brutal. So this too is like an opportunity for people. It's challenging, but it's an opportunity for people to see more. Human trafficking, drug addiction, all these things that are really brutal in appearance. They go outside the simulator in terms of shocking, the shock value outside the norm, the standard that people live in usually. They like their comfort zone. If something like this happens, a bomb drops in your neighborhood in Syria or something, you just get it just rattles you to the point where what else is there? Or you see people starving in the streets, and there must be something else kind of idea. Sometimes that's what people need. They just need that shock to consider that there's something else than what they're agreeing to. And of course, those in control don't want you to step outside that line. But eventually, or not, one in order to see more, you have to step outside that line of your comfort zone to see more of what's going on. So you can get in a position of being a risk taker to see what's real, and you really need that position to see what's real. You need that position of the unknown, going into the unknown, taking a chance, living in the danger zone, like REBISAR-DUANEVA-PALL says, to really see it the way it is. Otherwise, if you're in your comfort zone, everything's okay. You have no motivation, no inspiration to see other than what you agreed to in creation, which is your comfort, safety, security, which is all okay, but it's not going to get you into the real universes or the recognition of them, not into them, but the recognition of that adventure. It lies there for you and others. Okay. That's it for me, Kevin. Okay, we sing you to finish off and to set the stage for this great adventure that we're all on here. If you care to take the risk going into the unknown. So it goes like this. New you